Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Advisory Committee meeting for the Marijuana METRC batch tagging. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this afternoon's meeting. My name is Nicole Blase and I am the Rules Coordinator for the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission. A few housekeeping notes before we get started today. Today's meeting is being recorded. Please be aware of whether or not your phone or computer are muted. Committee members are asked to remain on mute until the introductions portion of today's meeting. Only invited committee members will be a part of today's conversation. Members were selected due to their level of interest or position within the community. With that in mind, we ask each of you to serve as goodwill ambassadors to the discussion so that you may represent your constituency professionally. Please be courteous to other committee members so that we don't have multiple participants speaking at once. You may use the raise hand function in Teams, or if you are calling in, please interject when appropriate and we will call on you in order. Non-committee members will be able to tender comments during the public hearing and during the comment period. Committee members, please state your first and last name when you make a comment. Please be sure that you have a copy of the draft rules in front of you, or let us know if you need a copy sent to you. Okay, let's get started. Today is Monday, August 29th at approximately 1 p.m. Many of you are familiar with the rulemaking process, but for those of you who have not yet had the opportunity, or for those listening in, I will begin by saying a few words about the rulemaking and the purpose of advisory committee meetings. The purpose of an advisory committee is to increase the public's involvement in the drafting and development of administrative rules. The Oregon Legislature, through its enactment of the Administrative Procedures Act, ORS Chapter 183, stresses the critical importance of the public's participation in policy development. Advisory committees are an excellent way to solicit input from internal and external stakeholders who are likely to be impacted by the development or amendment of agency policy and rule. Consequently, advisory committee invitees may include licensees, permittees, industry representatives, OLCC staff, members of law enforcement, local government, the public, local community organizations, small businesses, and other interested stakeholders. The purpose of having all of the members on this committee today is to hear from different parts of the industry and public health and safety partners. The Commission strives to hear from all interested parties. Our role today will be to explain the background and context of these rules and the changes that are being proposed in this package. We will provide facilitation to ensure that all committee members can provide input today. During this afternoon's meeting, we will seek your input on the proposed amendments to the marijuana METRC batch tagging. Today, staff will explain the proposed language changes to the marijuana METRC batch tagging by amending Oregon Administrative Rules Chapter 845, Division 25. Under Oregon's public meeting law, this meeting is open to the public, and members of the public are free to observe our discussion but may not offer comments. The agency will digitally record this advisory committee meeting and will produce and circulate a record of our discussion. However, because this meeting is intended to promote the open exchange of ideas, we will maintain an informal atmosphere and meeting minutes will record only the topics discussed and the main points made. Approximately 1 week after our meeting, we will post and distribute the meeting's audio. We will now move on to introductions. We will be calling on you to introduce yourself. When introducing yourself, please state your name and the organization you are representing. Again, I am Nicole Blase, and I'm the Rules Coordinator for the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission. And I'll start with some other OLCC staff. Amanda Borup. Okay, I'll come back to Amanda. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
Sorry, Amanda Borup, Policy Advisor with OLCC. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Stephen Crowley.
Stephen Crowley, Hemp and Cannabinoid Compliance Coordinator for OLCC.
Great. TJ Sheehy.
Good afternoon, TJ Sheehy, Director of Analytics and Research at the OLCC.
Great, thank you. Anthony Galtoski.
Hi, Anthony Galtoski, Policy Analyst for the OLCC.
Yes, and we have Commissioner Matthew Miletus on the phone today, on the meeting today.
Matthew makes it sound so official. Hey, everybody. Thank you for making it today. Commissioner Miletus, OLCC.
Wonderful. Thank you, Commissioner Miletus. Jessica Nyworth.
Jess Nyworth, Public Health Policy Analyst, just listening in today.
Wonderful. Thank you. And now I will go to the RAC members today. Rob Griffin. Okay. Sarah Morse. Mike Getlin.
Hey guys, Mike Getlin, Board Chair for the Cannabis Industry Alliance of Oregon, and thanks everybody for all the work on this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Murdoch. Danny Nguyen.
Hi, I'm Danny Nguyen. I'm a Tier 2 producer for Wee Farms.
Thanks, Danny. Todd Gregory.
My name is Todd Gregory. I'm with Epic Flower.
Thank you, Todd. Hunter Neubauer. Okay, Meredith Snodgrass.
Hi, I'm Meredith Snodgrass. I'm a Tier 1 producer in Cave Junction, Southern Oregon.
Thank you. Welcome, Meredith. Brent Stewart. Stephanie Doan.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Doan. I don't know if anyone can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, sweet. Tier 2 producer.
Thank you. Amy Parscale. Cameron Torabi.
But Amy was talking, but you're muted.
Sorry,
Oh.
I guess I was muted. Sorry. Yes, Amy Pascal, Ebb and Flow Farm, Tier 2 producer.
Thank you, Amy. Cameron Torabi. Tyler Bechtel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sergeant Tyler Bechtel with Oregon State Police.
Thank you. Colin Hobbs.
Hey, I'm Colin Hobbs, State Manager for Buddies in Oregon.
Thank you. Margaret Flershinger.
Hi, Margaret Flershinger with the Oregon Health Authority Medical Marijuana Program Policy Analyst.
Thank you, Margaret. Miranda MacArthur.
Anything special?
Last weekend.
Hi, I'm Miranda
MacArthur
with EMA Operations at Mountains Credit Union.
Nice. So.
Oh, dude.
Yeah.
If I could ask if everyone could please put their phone on mute. Thank you so much. While we're doing introductions. Next, we have Deborah Weigel.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weigel with MAPS Credit Union.
Thank you, Deborah. David Eagleson.
Hi, yes, this is David Eagleson here with METRC.
Thank you. And Michael Johnson.
Hi, I'm Michael Johnson, CEO of METRC.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for attending today. We're going to now move on to our discussion of the proposed rule language for the METRC batch tagging, and TJ Sheehy will now describe the changes to the draft.
Before we get into the actual language, I see Steve is on the phone, Steve Marks. I just want to make sure he's here. He was going to give some introductory framing remarks before we got into the nitty-gritty of the language.
All right, our Executive Director, Steve Marks.
Hi, good to be here. I'm happen to be at the emergency room and someone just pulled up, so I may have to get off just because of noise and other things, but otherwise I'm just here waiting for normal procedure with my wife. Thanks for this. I want to just say, you know, we're here to really look at the public safety issues and the issues associated with the economies of plant tagging of each individual plant, its benefits. Obviously, we're proposing a rule change towards tracking. We want to examine that with this committee. That is all we're here to do on METRC. This is not about the entirety of the system. This is not about all the other, potential changes you may hope to have and see as we look at working through our processes with METRC on this. So we'll be limited to that. TJ will aptly lead you through. I'm very pleased that METRC has joined us here, so they have a great understanding of what we're talking about, what it looks like. When we get to the process here, we will not actually move forward with enactment of a rule if we agree on a rule, if we think there's something the commission wants to move forward with, likes, you've given us advice and we want to perfect that. We'll have to go through a process of pricing that with METRC and working out in the contract how we actually pay them out of your fees. And they'll need authority to do that. Not sure on the timing on that because that would relate to costs, so we'll be working that through. But if you can concentrate on the issues at hand, that would be fantastic. And I really appreciate everyone's time and effort to help us out here to get to an answer on this and then be prepared to move forward in the future. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Steve.
Steve. Go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, so I'm going to be screen sharing while we go through the document. I just pasted the link into the chat for those who also want to follow along. So I'm going to do it a little bit differently than we sometimes do. Instead of going section by section and discussing each, I'm going to do a run through of the rules all inclusive, and then we'll have the discussion at the end. There's really only one kind of meaty section that's going to be changed. The rest are fairly minor conforming changes. So rather than sort of do what we sometimes do where we start with definitions and no one's really clear on like what the change of the definition actually means, we're going to go through the whole rule package, then loop back and discuss. So I'm going to share my screen for that part, and then I will unshare once we get into the discussion and questions. And I'm actually going to jump to that one substantive section. So most of the work that's being done in this change is in 7570. This right now is the rule that speaks to cultivation batches. And so what we're doing is, just for simplicity, we're changing it from the tracking of cultivation batches to the cultivation of all marijuana plants. So just some renumbering here to specify that this first part is about cultivation batches. And then we get into marijuana plant batches. So marijuana plant batches, right now we require the tagging of plants once they're 36 inches or higher. So this is just reiterating when plants need to be tagged. And the change being proposed here is, instead of tagging each individual plant, you would tag a group or a batch of plants once they hit 36 inches. This rule specifies that every plant is still tracked in METRC, but only the batch as a whole or batches would be tagged. C here specifies where the tag would have to be. So one of the outermost plants within that batch or the area where the batch is located. And this is what demarcates what a batch is. So we'll definitely talk about this first one because it doesn't have an actual number, but a batch is a maximum of a certain number of plants. That batch has to be comprised of plants all of the same strain. For grow sites, because the plants belong to patients and they're designated in METRC specific to a individual patient. For grow sites, medical grow sites, GSAs, the batch would also have to be sort of designated by patient. So you couldn't have plants belonging to different patients all within the same batch. Physically, the plants would have to be physically grouped in a contiguous area, and then they would have to be physically separated and demarcated from other marijuana plant batches. So the idea here is, for example, in an indoor grow, there's the trays and other things that sort of physically group plants. That would be a way to physically group it together and separate it from others. In an outdoor grow, it would be a row or a section, or potentially, if you're growing just one strain, as big as a greenhouse, depending on the numbers and other things we're going to get into. But the basic premise is a single strain, no more than a certain number of plants grouped together, separated visually from others, and then for the grow sites being cultivated for the same patient. I'm going to go back to the beginning now and then kind of go through where we've done these conforming and cleanup changes. So in definitions, instead of having to attach to a single marijuana plant, you're now tagging the batch as a whole. 2070 speaks to the pre-existing pesticide, fertilizer, agricultural chemicals rule. And so again, changing it from individual mature marijuana plant with that UID having to be recorded for the application of these sorts of pesticides or chemicals. Again, now it's the batch. In 7520 on UIDs, again, changing it from individual to batch. I just want to call out here where, you know, right now when it's tagged at an individual level, it's easy to know this plant needs to be tagged because it individually is more than 36 inches. Now with it being a group, the idea is it's as soon as at least one of the plants in the batch is 36 inches, that's the point at which it would trigger the tagging requirement. Or when one of the plants is flowering, whichever is sooner. I'll skip over 7570 because that's what we just talked about. 7580 is another minor change. So instead of, you all might remember that last year we made a change where instead of individually recording individual wet weights for each plant, we now allow you to put in the mean average of the plants being harvested. And so this with what the new functionality would look like, or the new rule would look like, you're effectively already doing that. You're recording the number of plants being harvested from the batch and the aggregate weight from those plants being harvested. And so this cleans up and clarifies that change to conform to the batch, and then strikes what is now a superfluous allowance for the mean average. And that is the extent of the language. Obviously, we have things to now talk about. The link, like I said, is there if you want to open it up on your own machine and follow through. But at this point, it's really just opening it up to questions, feedback, comments.
I guess I'll go first. Clearly, this is a step in the right direction. The tremendous burden that we all face in the industry, not only from 280E, it's only worsened by the amount of labor and money that we have to spend on tagging our plants. So I think the biggest question that all of us have is, what's the total number of plants that we can do? Like, how many plants can we include? And I think that ideally we'll find a solution that not only works for farms of any size, but also makes it easy for OLCC to regulate. Ideally, like I know at least from my perspective, we have farms that might be entirely one strain that are all intended to go for distillate. And it'd be great if I could just do one tag for that whole farm. If it makes it easy, like it's easy for us, it saves me a ton of labor. I think this year we're looking at $500,000 on labor and tags just for tagging. So I'd love to see what we can do to get towards a number that makes sense for everybody at a farm of any scale or any number of licenses.
I'll speak up too. I wanted to just put it out there that is there really a need to put a limit on the total number of plants in a batch? Because it really, to me, it's more about physical location and variety. So the strain name. So the same plant type, same physical location, same growing period, like growing cycle. Shouldn't really need any sort of limitations on total plant counts, in my opinion. It just makes it a little bit easier in general to manage, because it's like then you have to break up your cultivation field into different groups, so you're going to end up with a remainder possibly as well. It just seems like extra. What's the reason for it, I think, would be the question.
Yeah, I can just sort of frame out why not to exceed is part of this. Obviously, the number is part of this discussion, but we still have a system where the provenance of individual plants matters. You can only get it from certain places. You can only send it certain places, in large part because of the federal framework, right? So while we still live in that federal framework, the individual plants do matter. And so there is still a need on our side to be able to manage to create that line of sight and accountability for the individual plants and their comings and goings. So I think there is still a desire to have a number for our field staff to have sort of that universe of 1,000 is probably too many, right? So something that's more manageable for them to go on site and be able to see, okay, this is the physical area where these plants are supposed to be. And even if it's not necessarily counting every plant in the field, for this batch, counting how many are there versus what's in METRC. And for that to be feasible, there does have to be some sort of cap, really.
But every farm is going to have a different number of plants per row, right? Like how are you going to design that to where everybody can be efficient? I mean,
so and just to clarify, this is a maximum, not a minimum. So different places can do it differently, and it would also come into play, like you said, Colin, how many strains they are growing, right? Or how they set up for an indoor space, particularly how they set that up. So it can be as small as someone wants. It just can't go above a certain amount. And even if you have a strain that has, the number plus another half of that, you would be down to 2 tags now instead of 200 or whatever that number of individual tags is. So the idea is to balance those concerns, make it more manageable in terms of the accounting of the plants without making it unmanageable on our field staff with that change.
As the immature batch size is 100, it would make sense to be like around that number or at least that number. I agree, less tags better. What was that other bit? Oh, I don't think that matters. Yeah, 100 would be. Oh yeah, harvest batch is 72 hours, right? So like, how many plants can you actually harvest in that 72 hours? Like, a batch can't. I guess we're small and only have a few people, so like 1,000 plants is not really like that's hard for us in 72 hours.
Just a clarifying point on that piece as well. The plant batch is not related to the harvest lot necessarily. And so you can have a harvest lot and then a testing batch that's bigger or has more plants than a plant batch, which is for the tagging and the cultivation. So you would be able to harvest from multiple batches. The post-harvest functionality in METRC is not changing. So you'd still have harvests in METRC. You'd still have packages coming out the other side. You'd still have the testing and the testing rules. So that's just another thing to consider here, that the cultivation batch and tagging batch is separate from the testing batch.
So I have a hypothetical. So if we harvest, say it's 100 and you're working on your harvest, and what if you don't harvest the entire batch of those plants? So like part of it is into a different window of time or something like that. So would there be a rule to basically, you would have to harvest all of the plants in that batch at the same time within that 72-hour window in order to keep it in sync with the total weight?
So the actual functionality and how that would change in METRC is TBD. This is part of the conversation that would inform that. But the basic idea is, I think Stephanie mentioned that immature batches in METRC are currently tracked as a group with a count. And so, let's say, for example, that you have some of them that are maturing faster than others in that cultivation batch and that immature batch in METRC, you can move some of them without moving all of them. So the premise would sort of be extended through the direction we're going is that it would operate somewhat the same, where you've got, let's say, your plant batch of X and you only harvest half of them. Well, you would go into METRC and say the number of plants you're harvesting, whether that's half of them or all of them or somewhere in between, and you'd harvest that, and then it would deduct from the batch. because those plants are now harvested, right? So the idea here is not to interfere with the testing rules, to create new requirements that aren't already there. The idea is to make the accounting at the plant level easier.
Yeah, so I guess, so just walking through what that might look like. So if you harvested half of the batch of the plant tag batch, you would have 2 separate harvest batches associated with that particular plant tag. But the plant, as we do it now, the tag is pretty much irrelevant after the harvest batch window anyways. So you would just have 2 different like plant tag averages. Like you'd have 50 plants that average this amount, and then, you know, X amount, and then you have another 50 plants that average another amount. I guess it's just how it, but it's the same plant tag. That's the reason why I'm thinking of it, like, because now the way it is now, once you harvest that plant tag, I guess it's like a manicure harvest in a sense. It would be the only way to relate to it as of now. But if we were to do it this way, then it just adds like another little detail of like, how do we manage it? So I'm just trying to figure out how to make sure we account for that and not make extra strange burdens on like the process.
Yeah, that's valuable feedback as we start to think about the actual sort of in the weeds functionality and workflow. But you know, like I said, it's sort of like now if you have 100 immature plants in a cultivation batch and 10 of them fail to thrive, you mark 10 of those as destroyed, and now you have 90 plants. So it's effectively the same, where you would do certain things to all or some of a mature batch, and then you would deduct. So you keep a running count of how many plants are in that batch.
Okay.
But in some cases, we may harvest part of a plant at one time and another part at another time. Like I may just take my tops for flower and then use all the mids for live resin, and then, you know, my seeds for pre-rolls. Like,
and the idea would be that the difference between manicure harvest and, you know, regular harvest would still be there. So a regular harvest would deduct the count. A manicure harvest would keep the count, in the same way that now, if you harvest from a tag, a regular harvest takes away the tag. A manicure harvest keeps the tag for a cut and come again.
Copy. Well, I mean, if we have to put a limit, it seems like there's not going to be a way to really go unlimited, which I know there's a number of people on this call that really do want that. You know, we have to have a way for METRC to implement you know, our templates. Like there's templates in METRC right now, but there's no way to do this. So for example, with like when we had 100 seeds max per batch that we could do for cultivation, I had one farm that was 12,000 to 13,000 plants. That's 120 to 130 individual entries that I have to do per seed batch, and that's one of 14 farms. So it just gets to be really cumbersome at scale to deal with that. So if we are going to put a limitation on how many plants we can have per batch, we got to have templates just to make it so that it's not a huge burden for us on labor.
Yeah, and guys, Mike Gatlin here with Cannabis Industry Alliance and Old Apple Farm. You know, I want to kind of follow up on that point and speak a little bit to the background of how we got here. You know, this has been, those of you who've listened to me complain about this for years know that this has been, you know, something we've been working towards for a long time, and deeply appreciative of, you know, TJ, your work, and a lot of you guys at the agency to put this together for us. You know, one of my long-term goals with this project, and one of the main focal points we've discussed with the legislature that has kind of helped develop the momentum to get us to this rulemaking process, has been planning for the future. And, you know, I think, Colin, that was you, you know, you brought us some really good points. You know, I'm really hoping that this is the last time we're forcing everybody to consider these issues for quite a while. And so I think we really do need to have an eye towards how is this system going to function, not only in 2023, but potentially in 2026. You know, our partners at METRC are probably going to be here for a while, and we need to make sure that potentially when we have open markets to other states, when we have an even more brutally consolidated local industry, et cetera, that those participants that are doing thousands and thousands of plants aren't doing needless extra work. And so, I have a couple of questions on it. I'm obviously in favor of not having a specific limit on the number of plants if they are contiguous and separated and genetically identical. It seems like there are two things that I would want to understand from both the agency and METRC standpoint as to why we would need a limit. The first is from an auditability standpoint. Let's say, my farm has, for example, we run about 1,200 plants per greenhouse per rotation. So if I've got 1,200 plants under one tag, as opposed to 600 plants under two tags, or 400 plants under three tags, from an enforcement standpoint, and maybe Mr. Crowley, you could speak to this, why would it be better for OLCC staff to come out and have to count 1,200 plants and associate them with 12 tags as opposed to count 1,200 plants and associate them with one tag? So from an enforcement standpoint, we're trying to understand the functionality of needing a number on that, and if so, why is a smaller number better? And then my other question, and potentially METRC can answer this, at some point we're going to have to go back to the legislature and figure out how to appropriate and pay for this. So is it possible to speak to, the relative cost, so to speak, of having a limited number of plant tags per batch versus an unlimited number? And, we still are not exactly sure on how much the industry is spending every year on these tags currently. Does it really matter? Are we going to be looking for a lot more money if we have a limit of only 100 plants per harvest batch as opposed to a limit of 1,000 plants per harvest batch, or no limit at all, as most of us would prefer? So those are kind of my two questions. I'm not sure if we can get to the bottom of that, but that would be helpful for me anyway.
Yeah, so let me, Mike, thanks for the comments and the question. So let me sort of speak to your initial remark of sort of building the system for the future, and then do my best to answer the first question you posed. I'll say first, we don't actually, as far as I know, have any compliance staff who are able to make this meeting, but I can at least sort of speak to what I've heard from them, including Director Evans. So on your sort of opening comment about building the system for the future, I think there's agreement on that, and that's part of this discussion. I do think that there's a difference between sort of building a framework that we can build on for the future versus anticipating where it's going to be in 2026, 2027, whatever that future looks like. I think one is far more possible than the other. And so I think what we're doing is building that foundation where we can update as needed within that flexible framework. So as an example, OHA had their rules that were batch sizes of 15 pounds, harvest lots within a 72-hour period. And as the system has changed, the most recent rules now say harvest lots are a 7-day period and harvest batches are 50 pounds. So numbers are not fixed in stone. They're not, just static things that we live with forever. So there will be opportunities to keep that discussion going as things change, both at the state and the federal level. In terms of your question about why not unlimited, why does the number make a difference in terms of enforcement in the field? I think realistically, like I said before, we're not going to be counting every single plant on the grow or even necessarily every single plant in the greenhouse. I think in practice, what would happen is a selection of a certain number or percentage of these batches and then spot checking or verifying those. And so I think there is a big difference if a batch is 1,200 versus a batch is 50. It's a difference between spot checking 50 plants versus having to literally walk and count 1,200. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, the more time an inspector is there having to do counting or things like that, I don't think anyone's enjoying that experience, licensees or inspectors. So there is some advantage of making it easier for inspectors to sort of get in, get out and do what they're there for.
It looks like we have a hand up from Tyler White.
Oh, thank you. Greetings all. Tyler White, Verdict Cannabis. I really appreciate Mike's exuberance, and I have to concur with TJ's viewpoint in the, I think, crux of the issue here being harmonizing the plant limit with testing batches. And so it would seem to me that if a test batch is of 50 pounds, that, you know, it shouldn't be any more than a 50 to maybe 100. I mean, if I don't know a lot of people that grow half-pound plants, but it seems that somewhere around that number might be a reasonable limit.
How are you going to predict what each plant's going to produce?
You know, from Mike here again, and just in response to that, I mean, one of the things that's so challenging about this from the industry standpoint is incorporating in all of the myriad different grow styles that go into this, right? And it's very difficult for me to envision from my farm how somebody does grow, you know, large old school med style plants, because I'll run a 1,200 plant screen of green room to pull down sometimes in the early season 60, 70 pounds. So it's a very different, unique grow style. But I think one of the critical things here is to allow the Oregon rule framework and the way we interface with our tracking partners to not, what we don't want to do is be designing cultivation systems that fit into the tagging requirements. It should be the opposite. I mean, we ought to be developing tagging systems that allow the maximum flexibility for business creativity to produce solutions. And so, you know, from my farm standpoint, I mean, look, it's not, does it make huge difference to me if I've got a 100 plant batch or a 1,000 plant batch? I mean, yeah, it's a little more work, it's a little more cost. Either one's going to be a huge improvement from where we are now. But again, I want the flexibility to talk to my crew and be like, hey, you know, okay, we're going to switch half of our greenhouses to fresh frozen. And, you know, yeah, I want to run 1,000 plants a batch because I'm doing identical genetics, not have to break that up. But it's a really good point tying it to testing. You know, I think it's worth noting, however, that the process of getting to a 50-pound test batch didn't just simply happen organically. Like, that's something that we've been pushing and working for years and expending a lot of money and a lot of resources raised from licensees to help get that across the finish line. So again, it's, you know, it seems like it's important to settle on some number here, but, you know, if that number is down in the 50 range or 100 range, I'm just very concerned that we're going to be right back here again, relitigating this in a couple of years as, you know, as the industry changes. And God willing, we're all shipping in New Jersey and expanding like crazy and, you know, trying to keep the wheels on as we succeed instead of the wheels on as we get crushed, you know. So anyway, that's my thought on it. But again, I think that the idea that a 50-pound plant batch solves this or 50 plant tag batch solves this problem is a little short-sighted.
I have to push back a little bit on that and disagree. I think if we're, you know, really forward-looking, I think that the electrical grid here domestically is in high jeopardy, and that there could be some sort of Carrington event. And if that's the case, a lot of these individuals are going to be growing rope for the Navy. So, but in lieu of that, you know, hopefully that's not the case. It certainly has to be tied to that batch. And if you disagree with a half pound, you know, so a quarter pound then. So a quarter pound puts it at 200, you know? So, but somewhere along those lines.
Hi guys, this is Nicole from the OLCC. I just wanted to interject before we move forward. This discussion is only open for invited Rules Advisory Committee members. So if you are a member of the public, we're more than happy to take your comments at the public hearing, which will be happening in a couple weeks. But just for today, the discussion is only open to Rules Advisory Committee members. And if you would be so kind when you are speaking to introduce yourself and let us know what agency you are representing, that would be great for the record. So TJ, I don't know if you wanted to continue.
Yeah, so this is helpful feedback. I do want to bring in some of our non-licensee partners who are in this conversation. So we've got Sergeant Bechtel from OSP, we've got Margaret from OHA, Deborah from MAPS, and then we've got Mike and David from METRC. I want to bring you folks in, I guess, partially specific to this number question, but also just sort of the general framework. Some of you are regulators in a looser sense than others, but just want to pull you in on the sort of premise of this and get your feedback on the effect that this might have on your business and in the case of OSP, OHA, and MAPS, your ability to do the basic due diligence that you're sort of tasked with. Looks like, Tyler, you have your hand up.
Thank you, TJ. Sergeant Tyler Bechtel with the Oregon State Police. I've been thinking about this for a while and trying to reach back into my memory of all the investigations we've done since full legalization. And I can't think of one case where we've had to drill down to the resolution of individual plants over 36 inches and how they were tagged. Really, I've never seen a case of diverting, plants over 36 inches from the regulated market. When I look at the whole picture of the illicit market, I find that really OLCC licensees are just a small sliver of what we have to deal with. A few bad actors here and there, but it's really not a priority for law enforcement. When I think of the seed to sale tracking, and the whole point of it is to kind of keep that diversion from happening, keep it tracked within the regulated market for consumer safety. If the consumer safety stuff can be achieved by this batch tagging, I think that I'd be all for it. Really, it comes down to diversion of flour after the fact for us seems to be our biggest problem. And I think it's also worth noting that I'm getting a sense that this is extremely expensive and cumbersome. And every time there's a hurdle for the legal industry to jump over, that pushes more people toward the illicit industry. So I think really this would have no effect on my business and how we're carrying on our investigations.
Margaret, you're on my screen, so I'm going to put you on the spot. Any feedback? Obviously, the testing rules have come up. You all oversee the growers, even those that are in METRC. Any thoughts on an impact with any of those things, or any other thoughts?
I don't really see a big impact on the medical side, at least, since on the medical side, people are kind of bound by plant limits in general. So whether they use the batch tagging method that's being proposed or individual, there could be a cost savings for the medical side, but we don't do a lot of tracking of the strains in there. That tends to be something that more of the OLCC inspectors do, that kind of inspect the medical sites that are in CTS. So we're trying to look at that data to see if this even would make a difference for them. But again, being bound by plant limits in general, I don't see it affecting the medical side. Yeah, I don't see huge savings for medical, but there could be. I think we'd have to talk to medical growers to find out for sure. But as far as diversion is concerned, I don't think that these changes would really contribute to that either. Yeah, I think in general, OHA could support these rules.
Feedback. Miranda, looks like your hand is raised.
Yeah, Miranda with MAPS Credit Union. I just kind of wanted to echo what Margaret and Tyler had mentioned, where as long as the reporting and everything in METRC is transparent enough, we don't have an issue with these changes either. From our standpoint, I don't think we really have rights or room to say what number of plants should be included in a batch. But I definitely think as long as we know what the rules are and what we're looking for in reports, we are totally in favor of this choice. And it sounds like it is very cumbersome and costly for producers at this time to do individual plant tagging. And we recognize that in general, the cannabis industry is already so expensive. So at any point where there can be a break in those costs, sounds like a good plan to me.
Miranda, I do have a question for you. I know that
Yeah.
you get certain information from us on the OLCC side, and then you also get reports out of METRC from individual licensees. Could you speak for that second part from producers, what reports you get from them? And is there any impact here on the reports that you would get or that you do use currently?
Yeah, from a producer standpoint, we currently don't have an API with METRC, so it is all on our members to send us those reports quarterly. For producers, we get transfer reports, harvest report, plant trend, and package adjustment reports. And we're just looking to make sure everything jives within the membership, the financials, and the metric that we're reviewing. From our standpoint, like I said, as long as we know how many plants are in a batch and kind of what those rules are, I don't anticipate seeing a huge difference, similar to what Tyler mentioned. When you start creating the burden on the producers, I think that's where you see a lot of that diversion. So from our standpoint, as long as we're still getting those reports, we would be totally fine. It was kind of a curveball in the beginning when we were getting reports and they didn't align because of manicure trimming. So I think if we can puzzle our way through that, we can puzzle our way through whatever changes are going to be made.
Thanks for the feedback. David or Mike, do either of you have any thoughts or comments on the discussion so far?
First part, yeah, I'll weigh in here and then I'll turn it over to Mike for his thoughts. You know, first off, I appreciate the OLCC and all of you giving us the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. You know, as we're hearing, we certainly want to ensure that we're a partner through this process and that we're identifying things that can make the efficiency of compliance and running a business, you know, more optimal for everybody. I think that's something we're certainly in recognition of, and we certainly appreciate the feedback everybody has been giving to that regard. And I'll say from our end, we've been doing a lot of research into that to ensure that we can find the most optimal solutions. I think from our end, I mean, there's two components that we just kind of want to more so contemplate and just make, you know, folks aware of, if nothing else. And first, you know, being just when it comes to that number component, as TJ somewhat alluded to, obviously the larger you get to associate, you know, one unique identifier to a number of plants, you know, the opportunities for mistakes in counting, you know, and reporting could ultimately rise. Obviously, we would look to dive into all of those specific components, but as you have, you know, less data and less reporting, there's less aggregation and ability to dive into the details. So, you know, I certainly like the idea of trying to figure out how to build to certain numbers and ensuring there's still kind of transparency at some capacity on a per plant basis, even if it's not with a physical unique identifier. So, you know, I think that conversation was really valuable. And then also, you know, just notating from our standpoint, what we're seeing is like the majority of producers are using kind of METRC directly comparatively to an API or a third-party business tool, and just ensuring that you know, figuring out the best path forward if businesses do utilize METRC for that primary business tool, that they're able to do so at whatever capacity, you know, makes the most sense to them. If it is still the physical unique identifiers, which, you know, according to the plant tag study that we did, you know, in Oregon, we identified, you know, a cohort of businesses that certainly at least indicated it was a important part of the process of how they do things. Obviously, some indicated that it was not. So just ensuring there's harmony on those efforts between both sides of the fence, those that do like the unique identifiers physically associated and the individual plant tracking comparatively to what we go forward with on this discussion here on the batch front. So that's kind of just a couple components that I'm hearing and seeing from that stance.
Yeah, and it's Michael Johnson. I'm the CEO of METRC. I've been in this role now for, gosh, I think about 3 months, so fairly new. And so definitely appreciate the knowledge and the challenges that folks are identifying associated with METRC and finding ways to make your businesses successful. We certainly believe strongly that the best way we can support compliant industry by limiting the friction that folks experience with their compliance tools, and that certainly includes METRC and the individual tags. Our perspective is a lot less focused on the physical individual tag, although we certainly find some value in it, because just like the plants they're not grown with a unique identifier, being able to pick and choose to identify and see exactly what the implications are in some plants and some farms, and perhaps some of your farms and perhaps not. Some plants will grow a little differently, and a plant right next to another plant might grow differently. And so we found a number of operators that are very appreciative of their ability and our ability to provide a consistent tag that they're able to access wirelessly. We also recognize that that's not for everyone, and we recognize that there's a lot of opportunities both within METRC, the system, which I think TJ indicated that we don't want to get into in this, which I certainly appreciate. And if anybody does have any questions, thoughts, ideas, like things that they're struggling with as it relates to METRC separately, so I can respect TJ's direction, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have those conversations, and there might be a number of areas that you're dealing with that we're just not aware of. So we're happy to support you any way we can. As it relates to the individual plant identification, I absolutely agree. I don't think there's any way to really disagree with what Tyler said or what I believe it was Miranda said. I have the wrong name associated with when we look at the data, assuming the data is accurate, we draw conclusions. We're able to MAPS is able to support the industry, and I think anybody is able to see kind of in a summary form, and that's primarily how they're looking at the data. I would, however, disagree that the data should start at the summary form. And so, I mean, how you folks choose to govern your program in Oregon is certainly up to you. We don't see really any batch. We have one other state, but we don't see any batch conversation, mostly simply because the individual identification and the individual data points are very critical. And taking a look at looking at kind of a sea of 100 plants it's pretty easy to miss 10. And so from folks that are trying to do things the right way and are trying to support the legal community and help build and strengthen the credibility of the legal community, identification for their own means of the plants so that they can be as efficient, as effective as possible in the growing mechanism is the area we get the most feedback from in terms of making modifications to the system. But then as you extend further to folks like financial institutions, insurance institutions, they tend to rely on the identification, at the very least in number of the individual plants, so that they can have confidence in that aggregated data. So again, I'm not particularly not trying to enter into an argument or some kind of a dispute as it relates to which tag should be applied and how high it should be and so on and so forth. I'm saying that the data for the industry is extremely valuable and extremely helpful. It's your data. It's not METRC's data. METRC doesn't own the data. The state does. And our ability to provide the greatest visibility to folks that depend on you and that you depend on to be successful is really about having the most robust data structure. I absolutely agree that there are a number of ways that we can solve for a sophisticated data structure. You just don't see a lot of scenarios where folks are saying we want as little data as possible, and that's kind of where you're at when you're abandoning identification of the individual plants. And so it certainly is a risk to you. And again, this is up to you, as the state of Oregon and the constituents, to be able to identify what makes the most sense for you. And we, as your partner, are certainly happy to support that however we can on a go-forward basis.
Mike Gatlin here. Mike, thank you for joining the conversation, and welcome into the ring on this issue. After a few months, I don't envy you that catch-up time. We've got a whole room of licensees, and I would love to hear from anybody who believes it is a business benefit to track each plant individually. I think that it's really critical to keep an eye on the ratio of benefit to cost in a couple of ways here. So, for my small farm, we run a very high plant count, so admittedly our numbers are skewed in favor of my argument on this point, but we'll spend, approaching $30,000 we will pay to METRC to purchase these tags over the course of this season. That is a full-time cultivation staff. I mean, I could increase my cultivation staff by 25% simply by removing the cost of paying for these individual tags. So, at the end of the day, whatever compromise we make here is going to be exactly that. It'll be a compromise. But I'm really heartened by the fact that, we're hearing from our partners in public safety, we're hearing from our partners in public health, we're hearing from our partners in finance and support industries, all of whom seem to me to be saying that we don't need to limit these number of plants on these batches. And in fact, furthermore, that they believe there are benefits to decreasing the compliance costs for licensees, especially in an environment now where we are failing at a record rate. So, I think that it's really important once we settle on whatever number this is going to be, if it's impossible to leave it open-ended, to understand really what we are negotiating here. And quite frankly, if it is an ease of use case for OLCC staff coming out to the farms, while I'm very sympathetic to that, to me, if there's no public safety benefit, no public health benefit, and no banking benefit, and all of the licensees are united in saying that there is no business benefit in the small number of plant tags, then really we are weighing a potential critical pivot point in the survival of a lot of homegrown Oregon small businesses against the convenience of not having to count as many plants. And so in my mind, if an investigator comes out and we say, okay, well, we've got X number of plants under this tag, they're all contiguous, they're all clearly marked out, there's no confusion there, which we can craft rules to ensure, then really, if it is 20 plants to tag, 50 plants to tag, 100 plants to tag, all we're doing is saying, hey, farmers, you just need to pay more for the convenience of this system. And also, it is, we should be much more realistic, frankly, about the potential financial reality of these decisions that we are making, because whatever rules we come out of this advisory committee with, we're going to have to go to the legislature and get the money to pay for this. So this is a very complicated process that we're going to be involved with for a long time. And I would really like to hear from METRC, if possible, how much Oregon farms are spending on tax over the course of a year right now, how much of an effect on METRC's bottom line this decision has. Because that's important, and we should be honest about what we're really discussing here, which is a massive decrease in the amount of revenue that METRC gets out of Oregon, which is going to be part of negotiations moving forward for how the agency, the state, and the industry interact with METRC in the future, especially as we're in contract negotiations and have open bids next year. So, I don't know if this is the appropriate space for that conversation, but I'm really curious to hear from METRC if you guys have done the math on this and if there really is that much of a difference to you.
So, Mike, let me jump in real quick because I do see some hands raised. I want to just touch on a few things that came up. So number one, on the size of the batches and weighing sort of the quality or usefulness of the data by going too big. I just want to specify in terms of the rule, there's no minimum size. So if a cultivation does get benefit from individual plant level data, they could set a quote unquote batch of one plant and continue to tag them individually under this rule. And rewinding a little bit, I know we're starting to branch in a different direction, but I do also want to touch on, there's not a direct effect here, but just something to be cognizant of. Anytime something fails for pesticides, there's a harvest lot and then the batch that is tested and fails within that. ODA gets involved to investigate whether there's a misapplication of pesticides. And so I don't want to speak for ODA, but there is a possibility that the larger the batch, the harder it is for ODA to sort of itemize which plants had certain pesticides applied or got contaminated. And so I just want to raise that as a potential here, where there might be some sort of cost savings on the front end in terms of a larger batch size, but cause greater issues for licensees down the road if a larger set of plants are swept into a ODA investigation. Again, don't want to speak for ODA on that, but just want to sort of put that out there as something to consider. And I did misspeak when I said no one from compliance was on this call. You can see Gary there. He's on the bottom right of my screen. So I also want to give Gary an opportunity to speak to some of the conversation that happened related to number and the compliance on the ground aspect to some of this.
Thanks, TJ. Gary Wright, marijuana compliance technician for the OLCC. Some of the things that have come up, we've talked about on this issue, if we do go to this batch tagging system, is consistency within the industry as far as the batch, the locations of the tags, so that enforcement and inspectors, when they come on site, just the ease of being able to locate those tags, getting stuff all in kind of a uniform process for everyone, so that when we do come out, that it makes it an easier task for us to locate and delineate specific areas. The larger the batch, I see good and bad, but that's just something from the compliance side that I want to bring forward for everyone to think about, so that we can have some industry consistency, so that when inspectors do come out, it helps us to be in and out and not in your facilities taking up your time. Thank you.
And I do, Mike, want to touch on what you spoke to around the cost to licensees and your questions there. So obviously, Director Marks isn't able to participate in this meeting the way that he normally would. He was joining remotely. So I just want to sort of dive in a little bit deeper on what he was talking about at the beginning there. So like he said, we're not passing this rule this year like we would usually pass a rule, right? We've got other racks that we're going to be doing. We're going to be putting things out for public comment, adopting them in November. This is not one of them. It's going to be a little bit separate in terms of process and timeline, because what the idea here is that the agency will take the material tag costs off your books as licensees, and we already collect fees from you. And so we would pay METRC, sort of the net difference there, just like we do with the $40 a month facility fee, right? So Director Marks was speaking to the budgetary process that we have to go through for that. So really the issue here, we've heard a lot about tag costs generally. What I've heard the most that we are aiming to solve here is the labor cost involved in the tagging, the itemization of plans, all those sorts of things. So I do think it would be helpful in the time we have for people to weigh in on some of those differences, not only on tag costs as a monolithic thing, but the material versus labor costs, because I think that would be valuable for us as part of that discussion. So I just wanted to interject that here of in terms of kind of the nitty gritty details. That's the path we're on to as part of the contract. And I see some hands raised.
Looks like Amy had a question, and then Colin.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say also thank you everybody for the input. I've been able to listen to a lot of different perspectives here, and being open to the dialogue around all of this. And I definitely would like to just continue to keep the idea of unlimited number on the table as a point of discussion, considering that, considering there is no like legal issue with as far as compliance enforcement of, I think compliance from the OLCC side, to kind of dig into that a little bit more would be good if Gary wanted to comment or dialogue about that. But I do see from a practical standpoint that there's very little, it just seems to me that there's very little reason to keep plants in a separate, okay, here's this group of plants tag for 100, here's another 100, or whatever the number is that we all decided was reasonable. But I also want to say that the fact that we're having this conversation at all is great, and I'm super grateful that we're able to take this to the next stage and to help minimize the cost to the farms, because it's definitely an impact. And speaking to the labor, since you brought that up, we're just one licensee, so our scale of, the impact of scale that would have compared to what Colin deals with is a lot different. But it is a burden. It's an extra thing that we have to deal with. It's an extra stressor because of the ordering of the tags, how long it takes, the shipping costs, and then just having to get out there and do it and to stay compliant. And then it's like, oh no, we ran out of tags. Sometimes you don't always account for certain things. So there's other areas. So to not have to worry about that, of course, is going to help streamline our business tremendously. And then from just some very practical, going back to the unlimited, it's like, okay, well, it makes sense logically to have one tag per area per type of plant. And that makes total sense. I totally on board with that concept. When you start breaking it up into different groups, I just start wondering what the true reason is, especially from a compliance perspective. I mean, you've got a group of plants, they're all together in the same location. How are we going to designate which 100 plants this tag particularly applies to? So it's like, is it really helping solve the compliance checking issue as far as an auditor coming in to make sure that we have plants, the right number of plants? I feel like it would really require a full count in order to know if we're in compliance or not. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up, and also say that I appreciated Mike's very thoughtful comments in response to the grower side of things as well. So.
Colin, it looks like your hand is up next. You're muted.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Definitely, absolutely, fully support Unlimited and echo everything that Amy just said. I think it's the wisest decision for us to help us combat the cost that we have so that we can go after the traditional market, and make sure that we have every advantage that we can, because there's so many disadvantages that we face. I think it's pretty clear, METRC didn't really respond to Mike's questions on how much money goes towards tags versus what the state pays. I think it's pretty obvious that the massive burden is really on us as growers. That being said, we're huge fans of METRC at Buddies. We are multi-state operators and we deal with other tracking systems, and METRC is bar none the best. We love it. And I know there's a lot of people who probably don't like that I just said that, but we're huge fans. And at the end of the day, the only problem that we really have with METRC is the cost that we have to pay for tags. So I mentioned that we estimate that by the end of the year, we'll spend $500,000 on tags and labor this year. About 70K of that will be specifically on plant tags. And I think that's a huge loss. If we go to a single tag for a whole field, METRC stands to lose a lot. And I don't want to see that, but I certainly don't want to see us be hindered. In California, the state pays for the tags. It's not on the farms. And that's, that the labor is still on us, unfortunately. And that sucks because that's the hugest part. So maybe there's got to be a way for us to make sure that METRC is compensated appropriately for their fantastic services without having that burden put on all of the operators, because it absolutely has to be the most pressure on us as opposed to the state. So anyway, that's my thought on it. I can't say enough about how much having unlimited tags, we're already limited by the size of our gardens. That should be the limitation. I just think it's the easiest way for us to move forward, that we can continue to push our legal market and give us an advantage over the fact that, the illicit markets don't have to deal with this significant amount of regulation and tax burden that we have to deal with.
Colin, I apologize for not responding to Mike. I think I thought
why don't we let Steve? Hey, Michael, why don't we let Steve chime in?
Steve who?
Steve Marks raised his hand.
Oh, I apologize, sir.
No, you're good. Yeah, Steve, why don't you go, and then Mike, we'll get to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in, and couldn't really hop in when you talked before on my behalf, TJ, and I thought you did a good job. I just wanted to say, the cost pieces, I'm going to respond in terms of cost with METRC. Look at that and what you're proposing to do. I know it is vitally important to our future, but that's the next step. What we're trying to do in this rule is define what we want to price and what we want to figure out and negotiate in my mind. And until I have that, how we're going to look at it, whether it's 1 per 100 or 1 per 400, what that means for transition. I will say, and I heard unlimited very clearly in this discussion that just from practical standpoint, when you send someone in to take a look at you and you're tracking out, you're waste out from that, whatever that's touched to, yeah, you could do it with 1,200 plants, but it's a much more manageable job for us to see it with our folks in the field at a smaller number related to that single tag. So I respect that discussion a lot. I think that's one that we need to continue to have, particularly as we look for total cannabis tracking maybe, and how we deal with hemp on an interstate basis, as well as, intoxicating cannabis in that. But I'll just share with you from my own perspective. I'm hesitant to those big numbers. I'm trying to think of someone getting in the field with look at data, metric data, and resolving part of an issue. It may relate to your entire batch, right? If you're off, the 10 plants came from somewhere else. But I think you got to look at what we want to discern in terms of the problem solving we have to go to explain some of those things with your plants, and what works out and manageability. And the biggest discussion we had is individual plan levels doesn't do as much in terms of enforcement, right? Right now, at the discrete level, but at some level, if we're trading this off for sort of a human factor on it, right, and have more reliance on your data against someone being able to plausibly analyze that in the field with you, I think smaller relationship number is better. I'm not saying what it is, I'm listening, and I do appreciate the one strain under one number unlimited size discussion, but we'll offer that. So I just want to reiterate, I think the costing and pricing, which we'll be transparent about, is really the second step. METRC is aware of that. We've engaged and had discussions about what we were trying to do here. So we got to get the policy set right so we can price the policy, and then we can figure out how it relates to cost and metrics. So I'll end there.
Mike, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I apologize, Colin. I don't know that I caught all of the questions from Mike. I don't remember his name. I'm seeing like a bunch of names at the top, but I certainly don't want to skip over them. So to the extent that that I haven't answered any questions, or we get through this and there's more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. METRC does derive significant portions of its revenue in virtually every state from sale of the individual tag. That is a sort of a mechanism that has been more successful, I think, over the history of the business as it relates to how government RFPs work. Certainly somewhat different than what we see from others, and certainly different than what we see in some other industries, but also very similar to how licensing works. Usually states outsource licensing to someone. That company generally takes a percentage of the license fee, or if you pay to park on the side of the road, generally the app takes a percentage of that. So it's kind of it's not an uncommon concept, but nevertheless, whether it works going forward or something else works going forward, we're certainly interested and hopeful to be as productive as possible with everyone in Oregon to find the best solution. As it relates to some of the costs associated with tags and tagging, I certainly don't think it's probably best use of everyone's time to debate with me over whether or not the cost of the tag is too high, or I'm sure there's actually some people that are very shocking to that think it's too low. But what I can tell you is that there's tremendous benefit for some folks, and none of those folks appear to be on this call, but there's tremendous benefit for some folks to take advantage of RFID. In fact, I would say that actually I know for certain that the farms in all the states that we function in, and now there's 23, including the territories, the top, I mean, by a large margin, the most profitable ones on a per plant basis are the ones that leverage RFID for their internal purposes. It allows them to have significant time savings. And so to the extent that that there's a solution here, or a solution in a batch scenario involves the use of RFID, and there's benefits for you to be able to wirelessly move data and adjust data within your systems, we would expect you to spend less than 30 seconds per plant total in the entire life cycle putting data in. And so to the extent you're not, that means there's a gap in either the way METRC is functioning for you, or appreciation in what some of the opportunities are to use METRC in a more effective way. To the extent that 30 seconds still feels too long, and for some it's certainly going to, there's absolutely no question that we are highly committed to accelerating our development trajectory. And so in my time here, we've secured additional loan funding because it might be a shock, but METRC isn't particularly profitable in terms of being able to accelerate our product roadmap to make the product function much faster, much more reliably, and much more accessibly on a mobile basis, such that you're able to move your plants and make decisions on your plants with the data, which is your data and the state's data, in an extremely frictionless way. But again, those are things that are on the horizon. I'm happy to provide any additional insight to any person that would find that particularly interesting.
Thanks for that, Mike. I do want to, I have two things that have come up that I want to touch on a little bit more, dive into. So Amy talked about sort of the physical demarcation of how do you know this plant goes with that set of plants or that batch. So that is something that I want to talk about, is people's feedback on, there's that one line when I covered it, it's got to be on the outermost plant or in the area the plant is in. So I want to get some thoughts and feedback on that portion of the rule for sure. And Amy mentioned it. I also want to dive into this question of the cost of tags. It would be helpful for us to know. I mean, obviously I understand the material cost, right? There's the 45 cents, the actual cost for the tag plus the shipping, but it would be helpful for us to get a little bit more line of sight into what people talk about when they talk about the labor costs. So it'd be helpful for people to give some feedback on when you're talking about the workflow cost and the labor cost. And Colin, you sound like you have some of this budgeted out, so maybe you can start and others can chime in as well of what we're talking about, what we mean labor cost of the tagging and tag reporting process.
I mean, what specifically are you looking for? I mean, we definitely spend a significant portion of our funds on, our funds for tracking plants on labor. It's definitely way more than the tags. I
mean, I think having so when you might not have the exact numbers, but if it costs 45 cents for a plant tag, proportionally, what is the labor cost involved through the life cycle of that tag? And then what are those touch points or areas that the time spent, whether it's the physical sort of maintenance of the plant or tag and the recording of it in METRC. I'm trying to get a better handle on where those labor points are that contribute to the labor cost of the individual plant tagging.
I mean, certainly, the physical placing the tags on the plants, and then all the high cost labor of the METRC work afterwards. My compliance officer is on this call, and I could do a little chat with him and get some numbers if you're looking for any specifics.
That might be helpful. It looks like Todd has his hand up, so maybe while Todd and others are talking, you can look into that.
Hi, Todd Gregory with Epic Flower. We're a tier 1 grower, so yeah, I guess I can give a perspective from a lot smaller perspective on on a micro level, kind of breaking down the tags and what the labor cost is for applying the tags. We don't grow nearly as many plants as Colin does, but we harvest every week, typically 100 plants a week. and typically 2 strains. So, so that's basically $50 a week on the tags for just a plant, just for the tag cost, which, doesn't sound like a lot, but as a small business, it's $100 a week. It's more than our license fee for over the course of a year for the cost of the tags. Then when the tags come in, there's time to rip them off and make the tags up. We have to enter everything into METRC, so there's some compliance cost with that. I'll take them out. My guys typically we find it's most efficient to put the tags on when we do transplanting from the from the clones to when we put them in the actual veg room. So it's probably it's another couple minutes per plant to put those on while we're transplanting, and then we have to just maintain them from there. So I'm gonna say it's about $5,000 a year for us for the tags themselves, and another $5,000 a year, $5,000 to $7,000 a year in labor. So as a small business, somebody that's kind of living on the edge of success or failure in this current environment, $12,000 a year is it's beyond our difference level for sure. So any amount that we can do to reduce that, I don't really have a dog in the fight as to the whole having unlimited plant sizes. 100 does it for us, but I can definitely see the point in having a wanting to do it by just an area of plants. I guess I would like to see a little bit more clarity in the rules around because we're growing in pretty tight space, as a tier 1 grower. So there's not a lot of room for kind of peer separation of strains. So like the way we grow right now, we harvest 1 row, 100 plants. It's typically on 7 tables in a room. We have 2 strains. Usually the 2 strains meet each other in the middle of a table. So I wouldn't want to have to have some kind of overall physical separation, in my facility, between each strain to kind of accommodate this rule. I think we could accommodate that by just having some sort of a visual barrier between the pots in the middle of a table, and putting the plant tag on the next 50 plants. But it would be good to have a little bit of clarification on that. So when an inspector does come out, they know exactly what the rule is and what they're looking for, and there's not a lot of interpretation.
That's helpful feedback. I will say that the term of art here is intentionally vague on the physical separation, right? There's some value in keeping it somewhat open because we can't anticipate all the different permutations, but that is helpful feedback that more specificity might be helpful. Mike Getlin, I think I hear you trying to raise you're on the phone, so you can't actually raise your hand, but I think you're unmuted and want to jump in.
Thank you. Thanks, TJ. And as you guys know, I've been geeking out and borderline obsessing on these numbers for years. But when I run my numbers, I plan to spend about $26,000 to $28,000 a year on the actual tags themselves. One really critical point to bring up there is that the tag cost in and of itself isn't 45 cents a tag, because there are very expensive shipping fees associated with that as well. And for example, we requested a rush delivery of 2,500 tags and were charged $1,019 in additional shipping, which apparently was a mistake, and that was refunded to everybody's credit. But there's another somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total nominal cost of the tag that's added on in shipping and handling costs from METRC. Correct me if I'm wrong, METRC guys, but I think that's about where it is. In terms of hard costs, we'll spend about $336 per crop per greenhouse in hands-on labor to attach those tags, and then another $180 plus or minus in back-end labor to track them. So soup to nuts at the end of the year between purchasing, we figure the actual physical cost of purchasing the tags, not including the shipping, is somewhere around 50% plus or minus 10 of our entire cost of the program over the year. So I expect to spend about $60,000 on it, half of which is in physical tags, half of which is in the associated labor. But one of the things that is much more difficult to quantify and nonetheless important is just the quite frankly, the stress of having to manage that many individual plant tags. And for example, once I had a pretty decent cultivation employee quit one time because he just was so tired of bending down to attach tags that it was hurting his back that he couldn't do it. And it's hard. All of us who have been in there plant after plant after plant doing it, it's difficult. So, again, if we get to a reasonable limit, obviously I want an unlimited number of plants. I think that is the future. I think the more flexibility we have, the better. A reasonably high limit of individual plants still alleviates the vast majority of that problem, and I want to knock that. But for my farm, about 60 grand a year, half in labor, half in tags, and that seems to be consistent over time.
And Mike, how many, how much do you typically produce per plant in terms of wholesale packaged flower?
It's extremely small. So we actually don't run lights on our flower. We're an outdoor license in high-end climate-controlled greenhouses, and so I only say that because we're not your typical production facility, and so what I say should not be interpreted as the average, right? But we'll pull, we'll grow 1,200 plants to pull sometimes 70 or 80 pounds down from a harvest. So it's very low, less than a tenth of a pound per plant oftentimes, but that's how we achieve higher quality. I mean, sure, we can grow 1 pound plants until we're blue in the face, but that's not really where the market is pushing us. So
okay, that's helpful. So just trying to get a sense of where you're at there. So you must produce about 60,000 plants a year?
No, it's fewer than that. It's a little less than that, but close, yeah.
Okay, so with shipping costs and
again, I should clarify, this is under ideal circumstances in a business planning environment. The last year we've been run over by the market, and so we'll be probably significantly lower than that at the end of the year.
Sure, I can appreciate that. So the shipping costs are generally about in that 10 to 15% range. You're absolutely right. We're currently evaluating, actually some folks that we met recently, currently evaluating a partnership with a minority licensed grant recipient, I believe is the right term, but I could have that wrong, to create a second tag production facility in Oregon, which would mean that our shipping costs are will become significantly lower, and we'll also be in partnership such that any associated, we won't have any associated profit. It will allow for them in a joint partnership to have it at least on a consistent basis. I'm sure there'll be ups and downs in intra-month. But I certainly recognize that. I mean, Oregon is not exactly right around the corner from Lakeland, Florida, where all of the tags are created. So I certainly can appreciate that pain. On average, Oregon last year produced just under a pound per plant on average. And on average last year, the average wholesale for flower was about $1,000. And so our tag cost of 45 cents is less than 0.1% of that. And I certainly recognize that, and that's why I'm particularly intrigued by TJ's trying to understand more of the labor, because that's the part that seems a little bit like there's a little bit of a gap, and I'd like to understand that a little bit better, because we actually did a survey with folks, and I don't know if any folks that participated in here were part of that survey, but we surveyed 285 participants in Oregon, some of which on site we actually walked through it with, and 85% said, which is like the top of the spectrum, the 85th percentile, they spent 20 hours a week, but more than half spend less than 5 hours a week. And so our impression is that this is not particularly, because of what we've seen actually in the field and the responses to the survey, and 285 is not a particularly small sample size. And so the response we've gotten is that it's not particularly administratively burdensome. Of course, that's very different than what I'm hearing here. So understanding and appreciating that helps us to figure out how we can make the product better and more effective, and put you in a better position to be successful, more profitable, and certainly in an overall better state.
I have some of those numbers, and I don't think our market's anywhere near that right now. We have pounds that are going for like 200, 300 bucks. I mean, it's
that over the past year, your average.
So we spend about $3 per plant in total cost for compliance. 45 cents of that, I'm not even including any of the shipping costs here. 45 cents of that will be for the tag, and around $2.55 for labor, including the people in the field and the people behind the computer. We have a little bit of a different style as well. I mean, our intent is to grow for oil production. We do grow some flour for sale as well, but we're dealing with a lot more auto flour, so we have a lot more smaller plants where a lot of folks will have 1,200. We're going to have 12,000 on a field at any given time. So we are growing 168,000 plants this year, and it's a lot to deal with. Last year our harvest was 400,000 pounds wet. So these small numbers add up a lot. The $3 a plant for compliance, it adds up quickly when you're dealing with that many plants.
Do you use an ERP by any chance? Sort of. Yeah.
Sort of.
So we hear that a lot, and we have tremendous ERP partners, and I certainly recommend anybody takes a look at the ERP. The average ERP is $1,000 a month, on average for any size licensee. Some, as you can imagine, are much higher than others. So to the extent that we're able to help you be productive and be provide you the data or structure metrics such that it is a data repository such that you can be more successful, that is certainly that's the focus. And so, as I said, I'm not interested in being a tag company. I think the tag is a physical identifier. I think anyone would agree that if I'm pointing to two different plants that look exactly the same from across the room, identification of one versus the other certainly going to make that a little bit better. Now, whether or not that's meaningful to you or not is clearly I think for most of you it's not. But identifying them with some unique element is. I'm not really interested in. I don't think METRC overall is trying to peddle tags. We're a software company, and so we want to do everything we can to support what you have and what you need to be successful. And I believe, and we've demonstrated it, that the data is really critical part to helping you be successful and to validating the underlying elements that rise up to the batch levels for purposes of a MAPS or anybody that's really evaluating the data. So to the extent that you're spending money that you would otherwise spend putting data into METRC, but you need that data regardless of whether it was compliance or not, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at that. And then secondarily, things that I would never collect ever, but I only collect for METRC. I tend to think those are probably not the entire amount that you're speaking to. And if it is, then I definitely hope that you'll reach out. I'm happy to reach out to you to figure out how that time is being sucked up such that we can continue to improve and offer the best functionality that we can so that you're not spending that time on data that I think, regardless of whether this rule passes, is something that will be meaningful to you and being profitable with your business.
Stephanie, I see your hand raised, and then Amy, you had your hand raised. Do you still have a comment after Stephanie? Sounds like maybe not. Okay, Stephanie, go ahead.
Okay, Stephanie Doan. I'm a Tier 2 producer, Rising Leaf Farms. We're an outdoor farm, which means we do one crop turn a year. And so we do large plants, but we do 1,000 to 1,200 plants. And I can tell you that tagging 1,000 plants takes about 54 man hours. And so there's definitely bigger outdoor farms than us. And if you think about like just the ergonomics involved in bending down 3,000 times over 2 acres it's ridiculous. And then another thing we need to talk about is the fact that this is agriculture. It is a controlled substance, like all of that, but especially with the prices we're getting in the market, it's becoming clearer and clearer that this is agriculture. And you're not asking any corn farmer to go out and tag every single plant. And no corn farmer is going to get a ton of information from having information on every single plant they have in the field. Like, definitely, I used to be a scientist, so I love data. I love looking at data. I just geek out in METRC all the time. But we also keep track of our own data like that, and we're able to keep track on a plant level without paying 53 cents per plant plus whatever the additional labor costs are. So, like, fewer plant tags, fully agree.
for that feedback, Stephanie.
I'll just chime in.
Yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I wanted to add was it's the ecological piece of this too. It's a lot of plastic. I think it's an important reality. I mean, there's videos on YouTube with people just like mounds and mounds of metric tags, and it's just not really compatible with with an organic plant growing in the ground. Like, we do tag our plants with a much more lightweight material that helps us to keep track of things when they're in the nursery. But it's just a lot of extra waste, I think, is another thing just to kind of point out that we just really want to move away from that.
I completely agree with you. And it's actually kind of remarkable to me, like you mentioned, you use a different kind of a tag that's lighter weight, and we see that a lot, actually. Shockingly, we actually see multiple tags on plants more than we see no tags on plants. And so it's an interesting thing, to the extent that there's the environmental concern. The original, I mean, I wasn't here 12 years ago, but the original intent of RFID was for security, because it's really hard to counterfeit the fact that in the RFID inlay, there is a 16-digit global unique identifier, which you see on the outside. That is the part that makes the metric tag unable to be fully recyclable. The plastic itself actually theoretically could be recycled if you were to take it apart. So we have a couple of different ideas on that, but most importantly right here, these tags are made of 90% recycled paper and 10% hemp, and they'll be there in their final, as you can see, they're pretty close. So they're in the final testing process to make sure that we validate that there's no issues associated with any unintended environmental consequences. By the end of this year, we'll have a number of additional tagging options. And some of those options are going to be state dependent. So certain states are they care very specifically. Sometimes the state law dictates exactly how the tag is attached to a plant. Sometimes it's regulations. So a number of folks attach, as I think you alluded to, Amy, a number of folks attach things that smaller plant set or smaller tags or different kinds of tags that they find to be more suitable to what they're trying to solve for. And we can certainly appreciate that. And actually on the back of the new tag is a white section, because a lot of people will mark the tag up with Sharpie or additional information. But some folks have inquired about, hey, I like this tag. Some folks actually use RFID, like this tag. They like the idea of having a sticker that they can add to that they can affix to a tag that they already like. There's some folks that prefer tags that are staked in the ground, and in certain states, as I mentioned, you can't do that. There's other folks that prefer tags that bend on each other, like on themselves, similar to what you might find on a plant in like a Lowe's or a Home Depot. So there's a number of different scenarios. And so what I would encourage you with this rule, and again, it's not up to me, it's up to you. There's different solutions for different types of groups. And I think what ultimately it's going to come down to for your group, and I think a lot of you are in the no tags ever group, and that's certainly, that might make sense for your group. I don't know enough about each individual group, but there's going to be a number of folks like Colin that may find value in a different structure. And I think that this is a little bit more what you're talking about and what everyone's talking about, although maybe not everybody on this call, but in general, there's some nuance to this. And to the extent that METRC can be a partner in identifying that, I certainly recognize there's been some challenges in the past, and I appreciate some of the good words from some folks. But we haven't been the greatest solution that everybody can rely on day in and day out. I think there's probably more good days than bad. But we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are extremely committed to making sure that we're doing everything we can to provide the most flexibility in the system, such that you're not spending $3 a plant. That's just not, or I think you said $3.55. I can't read my handwriting, but spending something in that effect for a plant, that's just not, it's not going to help. That's not going to support you. And we do see some best practices across different states for different growers. And frequently they actually all of the time, they involved different plant identification. And so to the extent that a tag or this kind of tag doesn't work for you, or putting data in doesn't work for you, then that's a problem that we can certainly solve for. One item that I did want to mention is Oregon's the only state, I believe, that requires the tag to be applied when the plant is at 36 inches, and that requires you to get down lower. So generally speaking, in most states, you apply the tag much earlier. And so when the plants are, when they're smaller, they're in front of you, you're not really bending down lower. Now, I have had some different conversations with folks that are like, well, it weighs down the plant, or it takes a different approach, or like somehow it doesn't work for us as well. but that certainly would keep somebody from bending down. And again, I'm sure that's very different depending on how if you're an outdoor grower or how your individual farm works. But even then, if that's the biggest issue in terms of bending down, there's ways to solve for that. RFID is ubiquitous across every supply chain. Walmart actually started requiring RFID tags on every package actually by the end of the year. In Oregon, every single cow, which sells for a lot less than a pound of cannabis, even now, is required to have an RFID tag on its ear. There's a number of different ways that METRC itself can be modified, and a number of nuances that I think each and every one of you are trying to solve for to make your business as successful as possible. Is certainly something that I want to hear, and I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can on it. Doesn't mean I'm going to be able to solve every problem, but I do recognize, and I think probably as a parent, that some folks have different use cases and different issues that they're trying to solve for with batch tagging than others. And there could be more advantageous and more profitable solutions. I don't know, but I'm happy to have those.
Meredith, I see your hand up. One thing I want to say before we jump to you, like the batch size being a cap, a ceiling, not a floor. I just want to clarify that the 36 inches is a ceiling, not a floor, so people can tag earlier if that is what they want to be doing. The 36 inches is sort of a no later then. So just want to clarify that and make sure everyone's on the same page there. Meredith.
Hi, Meredith Snodgrass, Tier 1 producer, Snodgrass Family Genetics. I wanted to first off say that I really appreciate the whole process, the opportunity to speak and participate, and really appreciate the fact that you guys are working on this. It's definitely been a hard part for our farm to afford the time to deal with all the tags as well as the cost. And I want to really thank Amy for bringing up the environmental impact. That's been just a real sore spot of mine ever since the beginning. And thank you, Michael, for showing us the new tags and what you're trying to do to make them better. It looks like you're on a good path there. It's really hard to keep the trash out of a garden. And one of our biggest concerns on our garden is having a clean, organic space and good soil that we can count on to be there for all the generations to come and to be clean and unpolluted. So that's pretty much what I want to say. And I do respect the need for the idea that there needs to be a limit on a batch size, but I'm kind of with the other producers who are saying it doesn't need a limit, because when you have, if you can designate the space and you have different strains and they're all together, like Amy said, where would you put the next tag? If you have a limit of 100 plants and your row fits 265 plants, and if your batch size is 100, then are you going to have 3 tags throughout the whole row, or where do you put the tags? So I'm with the unlimited limit number there. I understand the desire to be able to track and follow each plant and the data, but as a farmer, I don't really necessarily need that so much. I'm more interested in how my plants are growing and what I'm getting out of it in the end. So that's all. Thanks you for the time to speak.
Thanks, Meredith. And that's a good segue. I want to talk a little bit and get some feedback on the sort of nature of the tagging and the demarcation. Heard Meredith speak to sort of, well, what if the cap is below what the size of the row is? I think it was Todd raising the point that it would be helpful to get more specific. Other thoughts people have on the way the language is now, like I said, sort of intentionally vague, but things that people are wondering about, or comments or suggestions on ways to clarify that language.
TJ Mike here. Just to throw it in, we use just a physical tape line demarcation even in our beds where we've got individual plant tags now. If we have multiple strains in the same bed, we just have a physical, visible demarcation, so our employees know the difference. And that's kind of what it seemed like you guys were zeroing in on the rules, which we really love. I think that would be fine.
For an outdoor grow, how are people, obviously tape is going to work less well on soil. So if you're growing in pots, that's one thing. Any outdoor growers care to weigh in on how you're physically separating strains or for your own purposes where you want plants to be demarcated or visually separate from others? Amy, go ahead.
Sure. So we typically try to keep the same varieties in the same rows in our greenhouses and in our outdoor fields. However, sometimes we run out of a certain variety, like we have extra of one and more of another, and so we'll sometimes, just to fill the row out, we'll put other varieties in. So yeah, I mean, in those circumstances, we typically use just like regular landscaping flags to just mark the areas where the plant begins and ends, where the group of those plants would begin or end, to help us with when it comes to harvesting and making sure that our staff is paying attention to what's what there. So.
Thanks for that. Any other feedback from anyone in terms of either their current practice or things that would be helpful to clarify or get more specific on in rule?
I have a suggestion, I guess. I mean, I know how many of us want to have unlimited, but I'm also understanding of the likelihood of that happening. Maybe the answer is to not set a number. Maybe the answer is to say per row. We have locations built in METRC, and at the end of the day, if I can't put one tag on a whole garden, maybe just having one tag for every row solves a lot of problems for a lot of us and makes it easy for, anybody who needs to come and do an inspection to walk down a single row and count every plant. Easy, done. Like, none of us have fields that are massive, right? We're all limited, and it makes it easy to walk down the other direction and see, okay, you have this many rows. Now I've checked every tag on this farm. Just to put out another option, maybe we're all thinking about a number that it needs to be when every single one of us has a different sized or shaped farm. I mean, one of my farms looks like the Big Dipper. We can't make a one size fits all here unless it is unlimited. So maybe this is the way to do it if we don't have to come up with a specific number. Just a thought. I don't know if anybody else agrees with that.
What about, Mike Getlin here, what about instead of a limit on the plant counts, some sort of a spatial limit on the contiguous area? So, for example, and I haven't even thought this through, I'm kind of thinking aloud, but what if instead of saying, we have a 200 plant limit per tag, saying we've got a 1,000 square foot limit per tag of canopy or something like that? Does that help from an enforcement standpoint, which I think is all we really care about at this point?
That's good feedback, Colin and Mike. We'll definitely noodle on this a little bit more as we develop this. So that's really the extent of the specific questions that I had. Hunter, it looks like you've got your hand raised. We can't hear you, or at least I can't. It doesn't look like you're muted. There you go. Okay.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say this has been really educational, and I'm very thankful to be part of this committee. I've learned a lot from multiple different angles today. It seems like, and I apologize, I haven't been on the screen. I've been driving. I'm trying to make sales here in this very challenging market to stay alive like the rest of us. So I'm doing a little bit of work at the same time. It sounds to me that we have to come to a number because there needs to be a cost associated for the OLCC to cover due to a contract with METRC. Is that incorrect or correct?
So I would say it's not the sole reason, right? Like we talked about the reasons why a ceiling on the count is helpful just from an inspection standpoint. But you know, as Steve said, part of this is getting something close enough to then take to the legislature for the budget conversation. And you know, we have data on plant counts. We don't have data on number of rows or you know, how many plants per space. So I think what you're describing is definitely a factor.
That's super helpful. I mean, obviously, I was just going to say that's helpful. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, Hunter. You and I do this all the time, and it's usually my fault. I'm sorry.
No worries. Go ahead.
I was going to potentially ask TJ if there's a pathway to present two different options. Really, it sounds like what the point of this is to come up with a proposed set of rules and then present that to the powers that be for a price tag and then go try and get it. Is there an option here to present multiple options to METRC, say, okay, how is this going to change our contract if it is, you know, 100 plants or 500 plants or no limit? You know, again, we can't get the product for free, and the vast majority of METRC's revenue comes from plant tag sales here. So, you know, I get that, but I'm wondering if we don't, I don't know. Does the Rules Advisory Committee work that way? Can we do that?
So, I mean, I would say that behind the scenes, right, we're constantly on the OLCC side. What goes to the commission is a staff recommendation, right? And so behind the scenes, that staff recommendation takes a variety of forms, but that process usually does include sort of pros and cons and alternative analysis. So 100% on almost any rule we present, there's a discussion of option A, option B, option Z on the OLCC side. I would say that sort of the contract nitty-gritty details are out of the scope of this discussion. What we're talking about here is what's going to make this system function for Oregon in terms of the rule requirements, compliance, business needs of licensees. So, you know, I think what the cost structure looks like is a conversation outside of the scope of this meeting. Hunter, did you have any other things to add there?
I don't think so. No, I appreciate, again, yeah, the opportunity to be part of the Rules Advisory Committee. And it seems like we should be able to come to a number that makes sense for farms that are small and farms that are big. I don't know how we do that. Maybe we associate that by tier of license, so you can have tier 1, tier 2 type situation. So there might be some opportunities there.
Thanks for the feedback, Hunter. David Eagleson, you've had your hand raised for a little bit. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, you teed me up pretty well, TJ, with the segue of getting off of kind of the plant count number and just kind of a couple other things as I look through the rule that I just either were intentionally silent on or I just wanted to at least bring kind of to the forefront. So it was a little bit, we touched on it a little bit on manicuring versus harvesting and just ensuring kind of an understanding of the expectations of manicuring plants in a batch format. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there to see if this is worthwhile for the discussion of this group. And then the other component that, you know, I don't think as I look at kind of the METRC side of things that we've talked too much about is the expectations of, you know, genetics tracking when it comes to mother plants, and if that's intended to be, you know, treated in some level of batch format or keeping that as kind of individual identification when creating plantings and sourcing that information. So those are my two kind of thoughts out there.
Yeah, thanks for that. So on the second question, and you might have to remind me of your first question when I'm done answering.
Yeah.
But on your second question, I think it's going to come down to, typically when I've seen mothers, they're in the veg room, not the flowering room, and typically they're standalone or separated out from the plants actually being cultivated. So I think the idea here would be mothers wouldn't be treated differently than any other plants. But the nature of how those are organized would sort of affect whether a mother is tagged individually or within a batch. On your first question, you were asking about manicure harvests. I mean, from our perspective, the idea here is that we're sort of extending or maintaining the functionality that we have for plants now for harvests. And so if you're manicuring, your plant count is not deducted. If you're doing a regular harvest, the plant count would be deducted in the same way that now, if you do a regular harvest on a tag, that tag goes away, it's converted, it's deducted, whereas a manicure stays in the ground as a tag, right? That would be, from our perspective, the premise. So I don't know if people have feedback, particularly on the mother aspect of this, of what I described is different than how you do it. But I do see Stephanie with your hand raised.
We're seed breeders, and like we do want that level, individual plant level of data on our mother plants. We would 100% use the maximum batch size of 1 for mother plants. One thing we all do have already is the OLCC has already given us a way to separate our farms into areas, which is we're allowed to have 20 canopy spaces. So if we divided our batches by canopy spaces, hopefully everybody has utilized that as well as they can. And then you would just be maximizing everybody at 20 tags per turnover in your space. Which, I mean, so then when people like Colin are, Stephanie Down, I forgot that part, sorry. When people like Colin are harvesting 166,000 plants, they're like everybody, it's equalized about across everyone. Everyone has to pay for 20 tags.
Yeah, that's helpful feedback, Stephanie. I guess the one thing, well, a couple of things. One, again, that number of canopies is a maximum, not a minimum, so not everyone hits that. But two, and probably more importantly, the canopy number is based on mature plants, whereas we're talking about plants that'll be tagged before they're mature necessarily and could be outside of those canopies because they could be in the veg room or something that doesn't have to be part of your flowering canopy count. But that's helpful feedback, and it's sort of something to think about of whether there's a way to kind of take that pre-existing concept into account. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, things you want to contribute? I think we've talked it to death, so I'll turn it back over to Nicole.
Great, thanks, TJ. At this time, we will move on to the fiscal impact statement questionnaire, which all of the RAC members received with their meeting materials. I will collect general feedback from the group regarding the possible fiscal impacts of this package, but for those wishing to provide additional feedback, please complete the statement and return it to us no later than Friday, September 2nd by emailing it to olcc.rulemaking@oregon.gov, and I will put that email in the chat. I know we've talked quite a bit about fiscal impacts, but at this time, is there any feedback on the possible fiscal impacts of these changes that committee members would like to tell us about? Going once, going twice.
But yeah, I mean, I'll throw in Mike Gatlin here again. Just to really put a point on it, this really matters. This is not like trimming around the edges. This could be the difference, literally, between staying in business and not for my farm. And you know, the more we get this cost down, both how much we spend on these tags, how much we spend on the shipping, and how much we spend deploying and tracking them, could really determine whether I can employ enough people to run my operation or not. And I know that that sounds dramatic, but at, at a time when we are being forced to sell top shelf pounds at $400, it is there's $200 that goes into trimming that, $150 that goes into growing it. And so if we are talking about taking, for my farm, $10, $20, $30 out of that in extraneous costs, this could be the difference between keeping people working and surviving and not. Every little drop in the bucket matters. And so I can't possibly stress how important it is to get this across the finish line, how important it is to change the basic funding mechanism for METRC in Oregon, and how critical it is to get those plant counts as high as possible to provide the maximum amount of business flexibility for us.
Great, thank you, Mike. Is there anyone else that would like to provide feedback? All right, thank you. If there is additional information you would like to contribute, again, please complete the form that we provided with the meeting materials and return it to us by September 2nd. And unless anyone else has any further comments, we're ready to conclude. On behalf of the OLCC, I want to thank our panelists today for providing their expertise on these issues. A notice of public hearing will be issued in the coming months, which will allow for interested parties to provide testimony or submit written comments. For more information, you can visit our website or email olcc.rulemaking@oregon.gov. And we will conclude for the day. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining and contributing today. Have a great day.